Welcome to Hauntales, where darkest stories come alive. I know many of you tune into these tales to drift off to sleep, so settle in, relax, and get comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed or curled up on the couch, let the whispers of these chilling encounters carry you away. Before we begin tonight's story, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales, and let me know in the comments where are you listening from, and what time is it. I love seeing how far our stories travel. For the best experience, use your headphones, close your eyes, and let every word sink deep into your mind. Now we begin our stories for tonight. The Unborn. Dr. Sarah Chen was a model of precision. At 34, her life operated on a strict schedule, designed with the same care she applied to her work at Blackwood Institute. Every day was mapped out, down to when she'd take her morning tea or review her evening notes, ensuring nothing in her life felt left to chance. Blackwood's research labs, where she specialized in the complex nature of consciousness, provided her with the endless puzzles she craved. To others, her habits might have seemed rigid, even obsessive, but to Sarah, this structure was necessary, a way to keep her mind sharp and her purpose clear. Living alone in her high-rise apartment, Sarah found a comfort in solitude that few understood. The quiet of her surroundings was like a protective cocoon, allowing her to immerse herself in her research. Her apartment was meticulously arranged. Everything had a designated place, a rhythm she rarely disrupted. Every morning she'd observe the city waking from her balcony, grounding herself before another long day at the lab. There was an order to it all, and Sarah took pride in her diligence and the small predictabilities that structured her world. Sarah's approach to life extended beyond the walls of Blackwood. With her precise nature, she cataloged every element of her day, even jotting down small observations or fleeting thoughts. Her journal, worn from use, was filled with neat, tightly packed entries, each one detailing the events of her day in a near-clinical tone. But her notes went deeper, with questions and hypotheses about her own mind, a curiosity stemming from the inexplicable feeling that something was missing. Though she couldn't place why, this emptiness had haunted her for as long as she could remember. Though her mother had passed recently, Sarah didn't let herself dwell on the grief. There was a detachment she couldn't quite explain, as if the loss hadn't struck as deeply as it should. Mrs. Chen's old possessions were packed away in storage, including records Sarah hadn't yet looked through. A part of her resisted delving into her mother's life, fearing she'd find an answer to questions she was better off avoiding. Sarah rationalized this avoidance, telling herself there would be time for that later when her research wasn't so consuming. Her colleagues knew Sarah as focused, driven to the point of isolation. Dr. Marcus Rivera, her research supervisor, often joked that she was so married to her work that the only thing she'd let distract her was a breakthrough. Emma Thompson, a close colleague, would sometimes express concern over her solitary habits, urging her to join the team for after-work drinks or the occasional dinner. But Sarah preferred the quiet of her apartment, where she could pore over her latest findings and trace connections, freed from distraction. Sarah's work at Blackwood Institute revolved around consciousness, a field she had been drawn to since college. It was a topic she couldn't explain her fascination with, a gravitational pull that never lessened. The study of split consciousnesses and dual minds was a niche pursuit, but for Sarah, it was the only thing that made sense. Her passion for it sometimes seemed more instinctive than learned, as if something deep within her compelled her to understand the layers of the human mind. As days turned to months, this routine remained untouched, blending into a predictable cycle. But predictability brought peace, a relief from the unexplained void Sarah felt inside. It was in the structured hours of her work that she could distract herself, losing her sense of self in the rigors of her research. There were moments when a question would gnaw at her: why consciousness studies? Why this particular path? but Sarah always brushed it aside, focusing on the data, the facts, the objective truth. In her field, she would tell herself there was no room for abstraction. Her apartment, neat and sparse, reflected the control Sarah wielded over her surroundings. A single desk dominated her living room, stacked with research papers and lined with journals, each one holding her thoughts on the latest developments. A faint, nagging urge sometimes surfaced, suggesting there was something she was overlooking, something hidden in plain sight. But she suppressed this feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion or the byproduct of intense focus. Her life was nothing if not meticulous, and Sarah wasn't about to let minor curiosities interrupt her work. It was only later, when things began to shift, that Sarah would think back to these early days and remember the subtle foreboding that had first scratched at the edges of her mind. For now, though, everything seemed as it should be: orderly, exact, and entirely within her grasp. And so, Sarah went about her life, unaware that beneath the veneer of control, a different reality was waiting to make itself known. The first inconsistencies were small, almost easy to dismiss. It was a misplaced notebook, its edges fraying from use, that she found on the wrong side of her desk one morning. She didn't think much of it, rearranging it without a second thought. But the next day, her desk lamp was tilted, angled in a way she never left it. She corrected that, too, dismissing it as an accident. Perhaps she'd bumped it the night before and forgotten. But these subtle changes began to stack, each one nudging at her awareness like an itch that grew harder to ignore. One evening, after an exhausting day at Blackwood, Sarah returned home to find her kitchen cabinets open just a crack. She distinctly remembered closing them that morning, having never been one to leave anything half done. It was an odd sight, yet easily explained away. Perhaps she'd rushed out without realizing it. But the next morning, the cabinets were slightly open again, only this time her spices were arranged differently: salt where pepper should have been, and herbs shifted out of their usual order. Sarah frowned, feeling the faintest prickle of unease. Her phone, too, seemed to have a mind of its own. Settings she never altered were suddenly changed. The brightness was adjusted lower than usual, and her notifications had been silenced, though she couldn't recall muting them. Sarah reasoned it was an accidental touch, something she'd done without realizing. Yet these minor disruptions were starting to mount, each one unremarkable on its own, but together forming a pattern that hinted at something deeper. A few days later, Sarah stumbled upon something that stopped her cold. She'd been flipping through her photo gallery, scanning the snapshots of recent lab experiments and reference material, when an unfamiliar photo appeared on her screen. The image was of herself, but not in any setting she recognized. She was standing in what looked like a dimly lit restaurant, surrounded by people she didn't know, her expression oddly tense. She examined the photo in confusion, her fingers lingering over the screen. She had no recollection of this event, no memory of the stranger she was smiling stiffly alongside. Her mind raced through possibilities: an accidental picture, a similar photo she'd overlooked. But the face staring back at her felt too unsettling, too close. Over the next few days, these phantom memories crept further into her life. During a lunch with Emma, her colleague mentioned the evening they'd supposedly spent together the previous week, recounting details that Sarah couldn't place. Emma recalled their conversation with a surprising clarity, a laugh and a nod, but Sarah's mind was blank. She searched her memory, trying to recall any semblance of what Emma described: the cafe, the topics, the light banter, but it was like grasping at smoke. Sarah smiled tightly, nodding along, but each detail only deepened the chill sinking into her bones. This conversation, too, felt like a picture of a life that wasn't hers, painted in colors she couldn't recognize. Her head began to ache and faint, insistent pulses, dull but relentless, as if something were pressing against her thoughts, demanding to be seen. The migraine struck at odd hours, tightening around her temples in a pressure she couldn't relieve. Sometimes, while looking at her notes in the lab, a sharp jolt of pain would interrupt her focus, and she'd find herself staring blankly, struggling to remember what she'd been doing moments before. Food, too, became strange to her. Meals she'd once found comforting felt wrong, their taste foreign on her tongue. One afternoon, she found herself unable to stomach her favorite lunch, the familiar flavors suddenly overwhelming and wrong, as though her own tastes were shifting beyond her control. As Sarah was getting ready one morning, she felt an odd weight in her left shoe, almost like an uncomfortable shift beneath her heel. She kicked it off, expecting to see a pebble or some scrap of paper lodged inside. But when she turned the shoe over, the sole was scuffed and worn, crisscrossed with scratches as though it had trekked through gravel. Her brow furrowed. She remembered these shoes as nearly new, worn only a few times around the city. Her hands traced the grooves along the edges of the sole, and the familiarity of each scuff felt unsettling, as if she were trying to remember a memory just out of reach. But she hadn't taken these shoes anywhere unusual, hadn't traveled outside her regular routes. Dismissing it as a simple wear issue, she slipped the shoe back on, but the sensation of strangeness lingered. Throughout the day, her mind kept drifting back to those inexplicable scuffs, the rough patches, the tiny rocks that had somehow embedded themselves in the tread. By the time she returned home, her curiosity had festered into a sort of anxiety. She took the shoes off by the door and examined them again under her kitchen light, hoping to find a rational answer. But this time, as she held them, her mind wavered, and she felt a sudden urge to reach out, to press her hand into the floor. She didn't know why, but the need was as real as thirst, an almost overwhelming impulse to ground herself, to anchor her body to the floor. She crouched there, breathing slowly, her hand trembling against the cold tile. It felt as if the ground might give way beneath her. The next morning, she found her shoes sitting neatly by the door, perfectly clean and without a single scuff. The soles looked untouched, smooth, without any sign of the rough journeys they'd taken only the day before. She felt her stomach churn as she stared at them, her pulse quickening as she tried to piece together what was happening. Had she imagined the wear? Was this some kind of trick her mind was playing? Each step she took felt like walking through a haze. Her thoughts clouded, her movements almost robotic as she went through her morning routine. She kept looking back at the shoes, expecting to find them scuffed again, as if that would somehow settle her mind. But they remained pristine, almost defiant in their cleanliness. The handwriting change crept in gradually, at first just a slight difference in her slant, an extra flourish she didn't remember adding. But the change soon grew unmistakable. Certain notes scribbled hastily during her late-night sessions appeared in a script she barely recognized, the letters slanting forward with a foreign elegance, like the hand of someone else entirely. She dismissed it at first, blaming exhaustion or a lapse in concentration. But as she continued to study her notes, the odd handwriting became more frequent, a signature that seemed to ghost through her journal. She would stare at the unfamiliar letters for long moments, an icy prickle running down her spine as she tried to reconcile the hand on the page with her own. The first time she lost time, it was barely a minute, a fleeting lapse that she easily brushed aside. She had been sitting at her desk, the faint hum of the city outside her window keeping her company, and then, in the space of a blink, the clock had jumped forward. Only a minute or two, she'd reasoned. But then it happened again, and this time she was certain the lapse was longer minutes that dissolved inexplicably, vanishing without warning or trace. She'd glance at the clock, disoriented, as if the hands had betrayed her. And each time the lapses left her with a hollow feeling, a sense of something vital slipping from her grasp. It was late one night when the most disturbing lapse occurred. She had been preparing for bed, brushing her teeth in the dim light of her bathroom, when a sudden blankness washed over her. She blinked, staring at her own reflection, and then, with a jolt, she was in her living room, her toothbrush still in hand, her reflection now vanished from sight. She stared around, heart pounding as she tried to understand what had just happened. 10 minutes, gone in an instant, with no memory to account for it. The transition had been seamless, as if she'd floated through those minutes like a ghost, unanchored from herself. The feeling to leave her apartment and walk to strange, unvisited places began to settle over her like a compulsion, one that tugged at her with a strength she couldn't ignore. She'd find herself drifting toward the door, keys in hand, with no destination in mind. Her feet would carry her as if by some inner pull, leading her down unfamiliar streets, turning down alleyways that twisted and doubled back in nonsensical patterns. The urge grew each night, an insistence that she could neither explain nor resist. By dawn, she'd return home, exhausted and dazed, the details of her nocturnal wanderings hazy and surreal. One evening, Sarah found herself lingering in front of an old, worn bookstore she'd never noticed before, its exterior faded and unremarkable. A strange certainty gripped her that she'd been there many times, that the stacks of books inside held something important, waiting for her. She entered hesitantly, scanning the rows with a mix of anticipation and dread, yet she felt as though she were missing a vital piece of herself, one hidden within the endless spines of the books she hadn't read. She left empty-handed, her mind swirling, unsure if she was being guided by her own thoughts or by something far beyond them. These incidents continued to build, layer upon layer, each one leaving a mark that refused to fade. Sarah's journals began to show the signs of her unraveling thoughts, half-formed questions and scribbled reminders that she could barely understand upon rereading. She could see her own uncertainty bleeding into her records, the tone shifting from clinical to frantic. She couldn't trust her memory, nor the words that appeared in her own hand. A persistent feeling grew in her mind, whispering that there was a part of herself hidden, veiled behind her every thought. On another evening, Sarah was winding down, going through her phone when it buzzed with an unexpected alert. The screen displayed a simple line of text in her Notes app. "Come home." The message was brief, almost innocuous, and at first she wondered if she'd written it by accident. She tapped into the note, expecting it to be blank or perhaps filled with a stray line from a misclick. But no, it was the only message there, and it was time-stamped for 2:13 a.m., a time when she knew she'd been fast asleep. She tried deleting it, thinking it was some sort of glitch, but the note wouldn't erase. No matter how many times she swiped, the words remained, a small defiant message staring back at her. The text stayed there for days, untouched, refusing to disappear even as she updated her phone and deleted other files. It was only later that she realized the note had vanished on its own, but by then the words had already taken root in her mind. Come home, she wondered what it meant, where it wanted her to go. The phrase echoed in her mind as she walked through her apartment, resonating in the silence, feeling almost like an invitation. She'd catch herself thinking about it during odd moments at work, her hand drifting to her phone, as if expecting to see the message there again. It became something she anticipated and dreaded, a strange urge that lingered just beneath her thoughts. One night the alert popped up once more. This time it was written in capital letters, a sudden command flashing on her screen. Come home. The intensity of the words sent a shiver down her spine, her pulse racing as she stared at the screen. She deleted the note instantly, but the words had already burned into her memory. It was as though the message carried a hidden weight, a subtle pull urging her towards something just out of reach. She didn't know where home was meant to be. The word resonated, filling her with an inexplicable yearning, and a deep sense of dread. The feeling stayed with her, haunting her thoughts long after the message had disappeared, like an itch she couldn't scratch. In quieter moments, Sarah would stare at her own reflection, looking for answers in the familiar lines of her face. She searched her eyes, expecting to find a flicker of recognition, something that might explain the fractures appearing in her life. But the woman looking back seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. Her own face felt like a mask, something fixed and artificial, and the reflection only deepened her confusion. Each time she tried to look deeper, her own gaze would seem to slide away, avoiding the truth lurking beneath her skin. As Sarah was winding down after a long day, she noticed a glass vial sitting in her bathroom cabinet, nestled between her familiar toiletries. The vial was small, with a faded blue tint, containing a dark liquid that seemed to shimmer under the dim bathroom light. She picked it up cautiously, feeling the weight in her palm, wondering how it had ended up there. There was no label, no instructions, just a smooth, cold glass exterior that felt almost comforting in her hand. She stared at the liquid inside, feeling a strange familiarity with it, a sense of ownership that didn't make sense. She couldn't remember buying it, couldn't think of a reason why she would. Putting it back on the shelf, she resolved to throw it away later, unsettled by its sudden appearance. But by the time she returned to the bathroom, the vial was gone. She searched every corner of the cabinet, her mind racing as she tried to recall if she'd moved it, if she'd absent-mindedly tossed it somewhere. But there was no trace of it, nothing but an empty space where it had sat only hours earlier. She checked the trash, even rifled through the bin with her hands, but the vial had vanished completely, as if it had never existed. The absence of it left a hollow feeling in her chest, an unshakable discomfort that clung to her long after she'd shut the cabinet. It was during one of these self-observing moments that she noticed the final, inexplicable change of freckle, barely visible, on the back of her left hand. She'd never had it before she was certain of that, as certain as she was of her own face. She rubbed at it, hoping it was just a smear of ink or dirt, but the freckle remained stubbornly in place, a tiny mark on skin she'd once known so well. It was an ordinary detail, one easily overlooked, but it haunted her in its normalcy, its implication that her own body was beginning to shift into something she no longer recognized. Sarah's sense of self began to slip, like sand slipping through fingers. She couldn't ignore the fragments piling up around her, pieces of a life that didn't seem to belong to her, moments that suggested a presence at the edge of her awareness. Her life, once so tightly controlled, had started to crack, and there was no way to close the gaps. The haunting suspicion that something else had slipped into her life, something hidden, watching from within, grew stronger with each day, clawing at her sense of reality with an intensity she could no longer ignore. The discovery began with a package delivered to Sarah's door late one evening. The box was worn, its label smudged, but her name unmistakable. She hadn't ordered anything, hadn't expected any deliveries, but curiosity won over caution. Her fingers shook as she lifted the lid, revealing a strange assortment of items that seemed hauntingly personal yet unfamiliar. Resting on top was an old leather-bound journal, its cover creased with age, the pages slightly yellowed. Her name was faintly inscribed on the inside cover, but as she turned the first few pages, a chill ran down her spine. She recognized her own handwriting, but only in parts. The majority of the entries were penned in a similar but unfamiliar script, as if someone else had mimicked her style, or as if written with the opposite hand. The journal entries covered months of events, travels, and personal reflections that she didn't remember experiencing. Some passages described locations she'd never been to, places she didn't even recognize by name. She turned page after page, feeling a dizzying disconnection as she read. The words expressed thoughts she could almost recall as if they were faint memories, but none of it felt truly hers. They painted a life that seemed parallel to her own, almost as though this other self had walked in her shadow, creating memories that now bled into her own, leaving her wondering where she ended and this stranger began. Digging further into the box, she found several photos, each as disorienting as the last. The first one showed her at a cafe in a sunny coastal town, her face lit by a soft smile looking content. Yet she had no recollection of this place, nor of the man seated beside her, his arms slung around her shoulders in a possessive gesture. The warm glow of the sun illuminated the scene, the background filled with vibrant bougainvillea and a glistening ocean. It felt like a captured moment of joy, yet the image twisted in her gut as she realized it belonged to a life she didn't know. The man's expression was intense, his eyes fixed on her with a fervor that sent a chill through her. It felt as if he were claiming her, his grip tightening in the photo, an invisible chain binding them together in a way she couldn't comprehend. As she examined the photo more closely, she noticed small details that made her uneasy. The cafe itself seemed familiar, yet she couldn't place it, as if her mind were playing tricks on her. There were other diners around them, their laughter and chatter frozen in time, but they were mere shadows in the background of her confusion. Her own face appeared carefree, but there was a hollowness in her eyes that suggested something darker lay beneath the surface. She had no memory of this day, no recollection of how she got there or who this man was, but the picture evoked a sense of nostalgia that felt entirely out of reach, as if a part of her longed for this moment, yet couldn't grasp it. The next photograph was even more unsettling. She stood in a dimly lit club, laughter evident on her face, but her eyes looked hollow, distant. The colors in the photo were deep and saturated, the lights blurred and swirling around her, creating a vibrant yet disorienting effect. A man's hand rested on her waist, his fingers digging into her side in a way that suggested ownership more than affection. She could feel the weight of his presence in the image, an invasive force that made her skin crawl. The scene buzzed with energy, yet it felt surreal. She was both present and absent, as if the laughter she heard was coming from a place far removed from her reality. The allure of the club, the pulsating music, and the flickering lights painted a picture of abandon, but all she felt was unease. In the background, the dance floor blurred with movement, bodies twisting and turning in a haze of euphoria. Yet, amidst the revelry, she stood still, a lone figure frozen in a moment that felt disjointed from her life. This was not the Sarah she knew. She was not a person who thrived in such chaos. Yet here she was, entangled in a world she had no recollection of stepping into. The intimacy between her and the man in the photo felt suffocating, his gaze heavy and possessive, as if he held her captive in that snapshot of time. The overwhelming realization sank in who was she in this life. And why did this version of her feel so unrecognizable? As she sifted through the photos, her heart raced. Each new image brought a new wave of dread. In one, she stood on a rooftop under a sky streaked with stars, the lights of a foreign city glowing behind her. She looked younger, her smile wide but empty, a shadow of joy that felt forced. The wind caught her hair, tousling it about her face as she stood with a man whose features were shrouded in mystery. The city behind them pulsed with life, but she felt isolated in that moment, adrift in a sea of memories that weren't hers. The man's hand rested lightly on her back, a gesture that seemed tender yet carried an edge of familiarity that sent shivers through her. The cityscape stretched out endlessly, a sprawling maze of lights and shadows that felt both enchanting and intimidating. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was a significant moment, yet she had no recollection of it. What had brought her here? What had transpired in the hours before this photo was taken? The man's presence in the frame felt commanding, almost as if he were protecting her from something lurking just beyond the edges of the image. Yet the only threat she felt was within herself, the gnawing anxiety of not knowing who she was, or who she had become. Another photo showed her lounging by a lake, her expression serene yet hollow, as if her mind had been somewhere else entirely. The surface of the water mirrored the sky, reflecting the vibrant hues of sunset that painted everything in warm tones. Yet there was an unsettling contrast between the beauty of the scene and the emptiness in her gaze. She reclined on a blanket, surrounded by greenery, yet the man beside her, with his arm draped over her, pulled her close in a way that felt invasive rather than intimate. His presence was overpowering, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of violation, as though this moment was stolen rather than shared. The way he leaned into her space suggested familiarity, yet she felt nothing for him. It was as if he had woven himself into her life without her consent, a figure in the backdrop of memories that didn't belong to her. The lake itself appeared peaceful, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the photo, a whisper of secrets lurking just below the surface. The fading light cast a golden glow around them, yet shadows seemed to creep in from the edges, wrapping around her, further emphasizing her disconnection. Who were these people, and why did they seem to know her better than she knew herself? The last photo Sarah found left her particularly unsettled. It was taken in a nondescript motel room, the walls painted an off-white that felt cold and sterile. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the camera with a look that sent chills down her spine. Her eyes seemed blank, her posture almost resigned, as if she were simply waiting. A man stood behind her, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. His face was obscured by shadow, but his stance was tense, possessive, as though he had claimed her. The photograph seemed to radiate a sense of foreboding, an impression that lingered even after she tucked it away. In this image, the details were stark and unyielding: the worn bedding, the flickering light overhead, and the shadows that danced in the corners of the room. It felt as though time had stopped, freezing the air around her in a suffocating grip. The man's hand on her shoulder felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on her chest. She could almost sense the tension between them, a power dynamic that left her feeling vulnerable and exposed. The chill of the room seeped into her bones as she pondered what had transpired in that space. Had she willingly entered this life, or had she been drawn into something darker? With each photo, Sarah felt as if she were peering into a life that had run parallel to her own, slipping through the cracks of her memory. She could sense a version of herself reflected back in these images, but it wasn't the person she recognized. This other Sarah seemed more reckless, more open to strangers, willing to let herself be claimed in ways she couldn't fathom. It was a life lived on the edge, haunted by choices she hadn't made, by connections she hadn't formed. And yet, in these brief glimpses, she could almost feel the ghost of those experiences echoing through her. The journal pages, too, seemed to corroborate this other life. She found entire entries written in places she'd never visited, with descriptions so vivid they left her breathless, as though she had lived them in some forgotten dream. Some entries described nights spent by the sea, feeling the salt breeze and the cold sand beneath her feet, a distant city glittering in the darkness. Others recounted intimate dinners and whispered conversations with men whose names she didn't recognize, their words slipping through her memory like sand. She scanned the sentences, searching for an anchor, something that would link her present reality to this fractured one. But each entry only left her feeling more disconnected, a stranger to her own past. Days blurred into one another as she lost herself in the mystery of these memories. She found herself reading the journal entries late into the night, poring over the words as if they held some secret code to unravel this second life. The more she read, the more she felt that strange familiarity, the feeling of walking a well-worn path but not knowing how or when she'd traveled it. Yet, none of these memories connected to her present life. They hung in the back of her mind, tantalizingly out of reach, each entry only adding to her confusion. The journal entries began to describe sensations so specific and so foreign that they unsettled her deeply. Some spoke of aching hands after long hours spent on unfamiliar tasks, or of the lingering scent of a cologne she couldn't place but seemed to trigger a twinge of longing. The words on the page conjured sensory fragments that felt disturbingly real, an echo of a life she didn't recall but could almost feel under her skin, waiting to break through the fog. She was beginning to question her sanity, feeling as though pieces of her identity were being replaced, overwritten by experiences that had no place in her consciousness. Night after night, Sarah pored over the journals, the photos, each line an image drawing her further down a path she didn't want to follow but couldn't turn away from. The life reflected in these pages and images felt increasingly like her own, as if it were written in her very bones. Every memory she read felt like a new layer of reality peeling back, leaving her with the chilling suspicion that this other Sarah, this stranger with her own face, was more real, more rooted in truth than the life she'd been living. It was a slow, spiraling descent into a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover, one that might reveal her entire life to be nothing more than a hollow echo. As Sarah's days bled into one another, a haunting feeling began to settle over her. Her memories felt thin, as if they were painted over something else, something she couldn't quite touch. She would sit, lost in thought, rifling through her memories of college, her early career, the way she'd built her life, and it all seemed distant. The memories appeared vivid, but their essence felt hollow, like she was recalling someone else's life. She would picture herself in those moments, the day she got her first lab position. Her mother's quiet smile of pride, and yet a detachment had crept into these recollections, as if they belonged to a stranger. It became unbearable at times, the sensation that she was merely reciting lines in a play, hitting marks set long before she could remember. Every time she tried to immerse herself in a memory, she felt herself hitting an invisible wall, a faint but impenetrable barrier between her and the life she thought she knew. The effect was disorienting, leaving her questioning if the very core of her identity was somehow manufactured. She would look in the mirror and repeat her name, as if grounding herself would push back the fog, but the feeling would only tighten its grip, making her wonder if Sarah Chen was even her name at all. Then, one morning while rummaging through her bathroom cabinet, she discovered a small orange pill bottle tucked behind her other prescriptions. The label had her name on it, along with her address, but the medication was unfamiliar, as was the physician listed. The bottle was half empty, its label indicating that it was prescribed months ago, yet she had no memory of ever needing it, let alone taking it. She turned the bottle over in her hands, her fingers brushing over the label, as though the answers might appear if she just looked hard enough. Her unease deepened. Who had prescribed her these pills, and why couldn't she remember it? The more she scrutinized the bottle, the more questions arose. The dosage seemed irregular, as though it was for a condition that required careful management, yet she'd never had any health issues that warranted such treatment. She stared at the label, trying to recall if she had even seen the physician's name listed, but her mind came up blank. The medication, too, was unfamiliar, its long, scientific name yielding no clues, only an unsettling sensation that this was something hidden, something purposefully omitted from her memory. In a bout of paranoia, Sarah opened her laptop and began researching the medication. Every search led her down twisting, clinical paths describing side effects she had never experienced. Some articles suggested its use in controlling behavioral changes, while others mentioned it in contexts that raised a chill across her skin: rare experimental treatments, memory suppression, and cases where patients couldn't recall the very symptoms the drug was meant to treat. She felt a creeping suspicion that this discovery was only the beginning, a first step into something darker that she'd somehow agreed to but had no recollection of. As Sarah's symptoms escalated, migraines that felt like pounding drums against her skull, accompanied by faint, untraceable whispers in her mind, she finally sought help. Dr. Helen Walsh, a neurologist known for her straightforward manner, greeted her with a calm professionalism that Sarah found reassuring. Dr. Walsh had been her mother's physician once, a small but stabilizing link to the only family she'd ever known. After listening to Sarah's symptoms, Dr. Walsh furrowed her brow, her fingers tapping a steady rhythm against the desk as she jotted down notes. Memory lapses, migraines, and feelings that your memories aren't quite yours, she repeated, her voice measured yet tinged with curiosity. Sarah nodded, feeling slightly foolish but desperate. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but it's real. And then there's the medication I don't remember being prescribed. She slid the bottle across the desk, and Dr. Walsh examined it closely, her expression growing tense. Strange, she muttered. It's not a medication I would associate with your medical history, but given your description, I'd like to conduct some tests, starting with a full brain scan. And let's add a blood test as well. Sarah frowned, surprised at the breadth of the tests ordered. Dr. Walsh explained, there are certain rare conditions, anomalies in DNA or blood composition, that could account for symptoms like these. It's a long shot, but it's worth checking every angle. Sarah left feeling a strange mixture of apprehension and relief. She was finally being taken seriously. Over the next few days, the hospital's sterile halls became all too familiar, as she underwent a series of scans and tests. She tried not to think too much about what they might find, but the flickers of memories of places she hadn't been, faces she didn't recognize, haunted her all the same. She waited anxiously for the follow-up appointment, each day feeling like she was slipping further from herself, her own mind like a vast, uncharted terrain. Dr. Walsh, usually composed, called her into the office immediately after receiving the results. Sarah sensed the unease the moment she walked into the room. Dr. Walsh's lips were pressed into a thin line, and her eyes were fixed intently on the black and white images on the screen. Sarah, I'm not quite sure what we're seeing here, she began, hesitating as she chose her words carefully. There's something unusual in these tests. Sarah's eyes traced the shapes on the screen, though she had no understanding of the patterns. What do you mean by unusual, she asked, a prickling anxiety creeping up her spine. Dr. Walsh pointed to an area where fine, branching neural pathways looked altered, somehow denser, yet erratically formed. These patterns, Dr. Walsh said, are atypical for someone with your medical history and age. In fact, they're atypical, period. They don't align with any known neurological disorders, yet they're extensive, almost as if. She trailed off, clearly unsure how to convey the gravity of what she was seeing. Dr. Walsh took a deep breath, leaning in closer as she continued. There's a rare condition called chimerism. It occurs when a person possesses two distinct sets of DNA, often because they absorbed a twin in the womb, essentially. It means a person is living with remnants of what would have been another individual's genetic material inside them. In most cases, it's undetectable, usually just a few cells, maybe some traces of different blood types. But in rare cases, it can be more complex. She paused, glancing at Sarah to gauge her understanding, before continuing. In some people, this condition affects entire organs, even the brain. But what's on your scan shows activity that's, well, it's highly unusual. Sarah's mind reeled. The idea seemed impossible, like something from a textbook rather than her own life. Are you saying? I have another set of DNA in me. From a twin, she looked at Dr. Walsh, hoping for some clarification, something that could make sense of this surreal revelation. The doctor nodded, expression thoughtful yet cautious. It felt as though she were under observation from some distant part of her mind. She watched herself respond, her questions unfolding, as if on autopilot, while her real thoughts lingered, sinking into a fog of silent dread. Dr. Walsh adjusted the image to zoom in, highlighting a strange cluster of activity deep within Sarah's temporal lobe. This, she continued, her voice strained, suggests a kind of neural activity we might see in cases of dual cognitive function. Sarah's breath caught, her heart pounding as the doctor's words began to take root. Dual cognitive function, Sarah echoed, barely understanding the terms but sensing their gravity. Her chest tightened as the words hung in the air, sinking in slowly. Are you saying there's another presence in my mind? She could barely bring herself to say it, but the question clawed its way out, tangible and terrifying. The doctor didn't confirm it outright, but the silence was a response in itself. Instead, she continued with clinical precision, detailing the implications patterns of neural activation that implied a divergence in her cognitive process, as if two systems were overlapping within her brain. We've seen isolated cases of this in patients with chimerism, where genetic material from a lost twin is absorbed in utero, Dr. Walsh explained, almost reluctantly. But these scans indicate something far more extensive than simple chimerism. It's almost as though part of your brain is wired to support an alternate consciousness. Her voice was low, each word seeming to deepen the cavernous feeling opening in Sarah's mind. Sarah's thoughts raced, grasping at fragments of what she understood. The idea felt preposterous, yet there was a cold, undeniable logic to the doctor's explanation, especially when considered alongside her own experiences. The migraines, the memory lapses, the inexplicable familiarity in places she'd never been, they all seemed to coalesce, pieces of a puzzle forming an image she didn't want to see. How long could this dual function have been active? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though any louder would make it irrevocably real. Dr. Walsh hesitated. It's difficult to say. It could have been dormant for years or even decades, only recently triggered by some unknown factor. But if this neural activity continues to develop, it may explain the symptoms you're experiencing. She shifted, her fingers flexing nervously as she turned back to the images. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, her world now tilting on its axis, each piece of her identity slipping from her grip. She struggled to steady herself as Dr. Walsh continued. This kind of neurological chimerism is still largely theoretical, but in your case it appears that whatever was latent has begun to surface, manifesting through distinct neural pathways. It's almost as if Dr. Walsh hesitated, her clinical confidence wavering for a moment. Almost as if the consciousness associated with that genetic material is beginning to assert itself. Each word landed with a hollow weight, echoing through Sarah's mind. The room felt colder, smaller, closing in as her mind grappled with the enormity of what had just been suggested. She felt unsteady, as if the ground itself were falling away, leaving her suspended in an unfamiliar void. The person she had always known herself to be felt suddenly intangible, slipping through her grasp, replaced by the terrifying notion that someone else had been lying dormant within her, waiting all this time. The thought left her reeling, a foreign presence that had perhaps been there all along, lying in the dark recesses of her mind, just waiting for its moment to emerge. Sarah felt as though her body had turned hollow, a shell containing fragments of a life that now felt fractured beyond recognition. Every instinct screamed to deny it, but she could feel, deep within, a lingering sense of presence that felt terrifyingly familiar, as if the faintest whispers of a stranger's thoughts had been woven into her own. Dr. Walsh spoke again, her voice laced with caution. "Sarah, I recommend that we monitor this closely. Cases like these are unprecedented, and there's no clear treatment path." The blackouts had become a near daily occurrence, plunging Sarah into stretches of darkness that felt like swallowing entire hours in an instant. She'd wake from these episodes not with the disoriented haze of mere memory lapse, but with a dread that simmered under her skin. Her surroundings would show traces of actions she couldn't account for: scribbled notes left beside her bedside lamp, files she didn't remember organizing neatly stacked in her office, the odd rearrangement of items in her kitchen. It was as though she were living alongside a stranger, her own hands moving to perform tasks that felt deeply foreign. In her workspace, she'd find pages of notes written in her handwriting, but the topics seemed to follow lines of inquiry she hadn't consciously considered. A large spiral notebook, typically reserved for observations on her official research, had somehow become a log of deeper, almost obsessive reflections on the brain and split consciousness. Entries addressed her other self, as if detailing a hypothesis she could later test, carefully recording what she had done or said during these blackouts. Each page held a bizarre yet systematic account, written in her usual tidy print, but with a slight slant to the letters, as though her hand had been guided by a slightly different intent. Even at home, her surroundings felt subtly altered after every blackout. One evening, Sarah returned to her apartment after work to find her books rearranged by theme instead of author, a system she never used. The change was almost meticulous, with books she rarely opened now prominently displayed. A chill prickled along her spine as she ran her fingers over them, their spines as familiar as ever, yet imbued with an unfamiliar logic. She couldn't shake the feeling that her twin consciousness, this other version of herself, had been making itself at home, carving out spaces she'd never intended to share. Food items began appearing in her fridge that she didn't remember buying. Strange ingredients, sardines, dark rye bread, bitter marmalade sat on the shelves next to her usual groceries, their sharp, unfamiliar scents filling the small kitchen. She'd feel herself recoil at the sight of them, their presence like evidence of a person she didn't know occupying her own routines. She considered throwing them out, but an irrational hesitation held her back, as if doing so would anger this lurking presence that seemed to be manifesting with each blackout. The worst discoveries lay scattered across her apartment in ways that suggested a deliberate intent. She'd opened drawers to find notebooks filled with observations she'd never recorded, their language precise, yet subtly different, as though her thoughts had taken on an edge of darkness she didn't recognize. Lists of tasks, some checked off, some underlined, marked her own plans, but with an eeriness that sent tremors through her. Analyze data, consult Dr. Walsh. Prepare for transition phrases that implied a path she hadn't intended to walk, and yet they were written in her handwriting, as confident as her own, but guided by a purpose unknown to her. Or nights, too, bore the marks of her twin's subtle occupation. She'd wake to find her shoes slightly worn, dirt on their soles that wasn't from the city streets she normally roamed. The feeling of having been out, without her knowledge, began to haunt her every time she left her apartment, each step a grim reminder that she could have already been there just hours before. Each morning, she'd check her calendar obsessively, wondering if she'd find meetings she didn't remember scheduling or tasks she hadn't planned for, as though her other consciousness was edging closer to taking full control. As she sifted through her belongings, a strange addition appeared at her desk, a locked drawer she didn't remember adding. Somehow she found herself rifling through it compulsively, her fingers searching for something without knowing what. Finally, she found an unmarked key, lying hidden beneath papers she'd never placed there. Her pulse quickened. The key was old, its surface tarnished, as if worn from years of use. She tested it against the drawer lock, and with a slow turn, it clicked open, revealing documents meticulously hidden. Inside, she discovered files filled with diagrams and notes detailing experimental approaches she hadn't studied yet, plans for neural reconfiguration, proposals for manipulating memory. The images, though rendered by her own hand, held an unyielding darkness, showing a focus on subjects in states of disassociation. Her handwriting, usually steady, looked rushed, erratic. Beneath one diagram lay a word circled heavily in red: integration. Sarah's heart raced as she absorbed the chilling implications of that single word. Integration. It felt like a key unlocking something profound yet deeply disturbing within her. The documents spread across her desk suggested not just a scientific interest, but a dangerously intimate knowledge of the processes involved in merging distinct consciousnesses. She found herself staring at the diagrams, their lines and arrows leading to conclusions she couldn't comprehend but instinctively recognized as perilous. Each page was an echo of her fragmented identity, a collision of thoughts that did not belong to her alone. Her thoughts spiraled with the knowledge that she was not the sole architect of her life, a realization that settled heavily on her chest. The dark recesses of her mind quivered with anxiety as she pondered the ramifications of these experiments who had written these notes. Was it possible that her other self had not only taken control during her blackouts but was also actively planning her next moves? The questions clawed at her sanity, forcing her to confront the unsettling reality that she might be sharing her body with an entity whose intentions remained shrouded in shadows. Days turned into a blur, each one punctuated by her obsessive need to uncover more about her twin consciousness. Sarah felt a pull toward her research materials, a desire to dive deeper into the realms of consciousness studies and what it meant to be truly aware. However, with each passing day, her curiosity turned into dread, as if the act of searching was merely a path leading her closer to her own undoing. Every time she entered her office, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, her twin's presence looming just beyond the periphery of her mind. Late one evening, under the flickering glow of her desk lamp, Sarah found herself poring over the extensive files she'd unearthed. They contained meticulous notes on consciousness theory that felt both familiar and foreign. The deeper she read, the more she could sense the presence of her twin weaving through the narratives, the observations about memory retention, the experiments on cognitive dissonance. It was as if her other self was trying to communicate a purpose through this meticulously crafted research, a yearning to understand not just who she was but who they could become together. An overwhelming sense of urgency pulsed through her veins as she began connecting dots between her research and the notes in the drawer. There was a pattern emerging, an insidious undercurrent guiding her actions and thoughts. The more she studied, the clearer it became that her twin was not merely a passenger, she was a co-conspirator, intricately involved in every decision, every experiment, pulling the strings with a quiet intensity that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. In a moment of desperation, Sarah decided to confront this duality head-on. She arranged her notes and compiled her findings, documenting every incident, every piece of evidence she could muster. This act of organization felt like an attempt to reclaim her narrative, to assert her identity in the face of the encroaching shadow. As she scribbled down her thoughts, a new sense of clarity began to emerge. If she could articulate her experiences, perhaps she could unravel the layers of her existence, differentiating between her memories and those that belong to the other self. Yet, with each revelation came a growing fear. What if the integration she had uncovered wasn't merely theoretical? What if it was a plan actively unfolding within her? Each blackout a rehearsal for a future where her twin would dominate. These thoughts spiraled into a labyrinth of paranoia, feeding her insomnia and sharpening her focus. She felt the weight of time pressing down, urging her to act before it was too late, before her twin could solidify her hold on their shared existence. That evening, as Sarah attempted to piece together her reality, her surroundings morphed into a stage for her growing anxiety. The mundane items around her took on an ominous significance: the scuffed shoes that suggested late-night escapades, the stray groceries with unfamiliar ingredients, the locked drawer that whispered secrets. Each element seemed imbued with purpose, a physical manifestation of her internal battle. With determination fueling her actions, she resolved to confront the heart of the enigma, to delve deeper into the abyss of her mind where her twin resided. As she scribbled down her latest findings, she felt the air around her shift. A cold draft stirred through the room, raising the tiny hairs on her arms, pulling her focus from the page. For a fleeting moment, Sarah thought she saw a shadow flicker in her peripheral vision, a reminder of the entity lurking just beneath her consciousness, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It was a chill that whispered caution, an instinct that screamed to stop, yet she pressed on, knowing that the truth she sought could either save her or seal her fate. Sarah stood before the mirror, the cool glass surface reflecting not just her image but an unsettling distortion of her reality. As she gazed into her own eyes, she noticed a peculiar flicker, a fleeting moment where her reflection appeared to smirk mischievously, while her heart thudded with apprehension. The connection she once felt with her reflection began to fray, replaced by a growing sense of alienation that clawed at her insides. Each time she caught a glimpse of herself, it was as if she were looking at a stranger wearing her skin, a tantalizing specter that embodied the duality of her existence. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the tiny motes dancing in the air, Sarah leaned in closer, scrutinizing her features with a fierce intensity. She felt an odd pull, as though the woman staring back at her was a window into a secret life she had yet to unravel. The reflection was unmistakably hers, yet the slight tilt of her lips, the arch of her eyebrows, seemed to carry an unspoken weight, a hidden knowledge that sent shivers down her spine. She hesitated, grappling with the creeping dread that whispered what if her reflection was a gateway to her twin's consciousness. As the days slipped by in a hazy blur, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to the mirror, her curiosity intertwining with a palpable fear. One night, under the dim glow of her bedroom lamp, she stood before it, mesmerized by the soft, flickering light that cast long shadows on the wall behind her. In that moment, she thought she saw her reflection frown when she smiled, a dark and dissonant echo that shattered her fleeting sense of control. The expression was eerily different, laden with something sinister that felt utterly foreign, leaving her breathless and shaken. Frustrated and desperate for clarity, Sarah embarked on a relentless quest for answers. She began documenting each encounter, her notes filled with frantic observations about her mirror experiences. The more she delved into this reflective phenomenon, the more pronounced the differences became. On one particularly haunting evening, as twilight enveloped her apartment, she stood before the mirror, and her reflection seemed to shift dramatically, the features twisting into an unsettling grimace. It was a haunting sight that felt like a warning, an invitation to confront the darker aspects of her psyche that were coming to the forefront. In the silence of the room, Sarah felt an electric tension crackle in the air, the atmosphere thick with unspoken truths. The once comforting familiarity of her reflection transformed into something ominous, each encounter fueling her escalating paranoia. It was as if the mirror had become a portal, revealing glimpses of the twin she feared and loathed, a harbinger of the chaos that simmered just beneath the surface. With each unsettling incident, Sarah's heart raced, the urge to flee overwhelming, yet she felt an inexorable pull to stay, to confront the reality lurking within. The more she observed, the clearer it became that her reflection was not merely a reflection, it was a manifestation of her twin's thoughts and emotions, pulling her deeper into the murky waters of their shared existence. On one fateful night, while preparing for bed, Sarah caught a glimpse of something profoundly disturbing. Her reflection blinked, even as she remained still, a disconcerting reminder that she was no longer alone in her body. The connection between them felt strained, as though her twin was trying to break through the fragile barrier separating their identities. Panic surged within her, a primal instinct urging her to escape from the confinement of her own skin. Days turned into a torturous cycle of anxiety and confusion, with Sarah grappling to maintain her grip on reality. She became hyper-aware of her surroundings, constantly checking the mirror, seeking validation of her identity in a world that felt increasingly disjointed. As she meticulously studied the nuances of her reflection, she began to question the authenticity of her emotions. The subtle changes in her demeanor were becoming too pronounced to ignore, blurring the lines between Sarah's true self and the disconcerting presence that had taken root within her. In an attempt to reclaim her sense of self, Sarah started conducting spontaneous experiments in front of the mirror. She tried various expressions, playful smiles, and heartfelt frowns, all while analyzing her reflection with a fervent intensity. However, the results were consistently disheartening. Each expression felt like a hollow echo, lacking the depth of her genuine emotions. Instead, her reflection seemed to mirror a distant echo, an entity that remained just out of reach. It was a chilling realization that struck her hard. Her own visage was no longer an accurate representation of her spirit, but a distortion reflecting her inner turmoil. As the unsettling encounters continued, Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to confront her twin directly. She longed to break the silence between them, to understand the motivations behind this duality that had thrust her into a waking nightmare. Each moment spent before the mirror became a silent battleground, a tense exchange where she sought answers, while her reflection remained frustratingly inscrutable. The atmosphere crackled with tension, thick with unspoken words, until she finally mustered the courage to confront the disconcerting truth that her reflection had become a living embodiment of her darkest fears. The day began like any other, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of impending dread that loomed over her. As she settled into her cluttered workspace at the Blackwood Institute, she felt a compulsion to sift through the remnants of her recent projects. Stacks of papers towered around her, a chaotic testament to the frenetic energy of her research. Yet as she reached for a folder at the back of her desk, her fingers brushed against something unusual, an unmarked binder that hadn't been there before. Its presence was an enigma, stirring her curiosity while simultaneously igniting a deep sense of unease. Opening the binder, she was greeted by a collection of meticulously organized notes that bore her unmistakable handwriting. However, as she flipped through the pages, a chill swept over her. The content felt alien, as if she were reading the work of a stranger rather than her own. Scientific terminology filled the pages, a litany of complex theories and references to experiments she had no recollection of conducting. The precision of her handwriting was unnerving, each stroke fluid and confident, yet the ideas articulated within felt detached from her understanding, as if they were the echoes of a mind she could not claim. The notes detailed an extensive study on consciousness, its intricacies, its anomalies, and the possibility of merging disparate consciousnesses. Sarah's heart raced as she realized that these writings touched upon the very concepts she had been grappling with since discovering her twin. Lines of text unfurled like tendrils in her mind, wrapping around her thoughts and squeezing tightly. She scanned the pages feverishly, desperate for answers, yet every revelation seemed to elude her grasp. The clarity with which the notes were written contrasted sharply with her own clouded memory, making her question who had truly authored this research. Amid the scientific jargon, she found a section that sent a jolt through her spine. It spoke of techniques to manipulate brain waves and consciousness, suggesting experiments that bordered on the unethical. References to the duality of existence flickered on the page, hinting at a profound understanding of the very phenomena she was experiencing. A mixture of dread and intrigue surged within her, and she was left grappling with a chilling thought: had her twin not only been present in her life but actively participating in her work? Had it been subtly guiding her research all along? As she delved deeper, Sarah's attention was drawn to a series of annotations scribbled in the margins, notes written in a handwriting starkly different from her own. The strokes were larger, more aggressive, each letter crafted with a kind of urgency that sent shivers coursing down her spine. It felt like an intruder had breached her mind, leaving traces of their presence in the very documents meant to represent her intellectual pursuits. The additional commentary reflected a mind that operated on a different frequency, intertwining her thoughts with something darkly sinister. It was a reminder that she was not alone in her quest for knowledge. Her twin had been there, lurking in the shadows, shaping her understanding without her awareness. Flipping to a particularly dense page, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The notes contained references to brain patterns, diagrams illustrating neural connections that mirrored the very scans she had undergone. Her heart raced as the implications sank in. Her twin was not merely an echo of herself. It was a powerful entity capable of manipulating their shared consciousness. The information detailed methods of enhancing cognitive function through the merging of two separate identities, hinting at a radical approach to neuroscience that bordered on the grotesque. It was a path she had never intended to explore, yet here it lay before her, etched in her own handwriting. Feeling overwhelmed, Sarah snapped the binder shut and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. How much of her research had been influenced by this entity? What were the true intentions behind the notes, and why did they resonate so deeply within her? The sense of alienation intensified, swirling into a storm of anxiety that threatened to consume her. With each passing moment, she realized that her identity was entangled in a web of manipulation, and the quest for answers had become a treacherous journey into the unknown. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Sarah decided to confront the unsettling notes head-on. She meticulously reorganized the contents of the binder, marking the sections that felt the most foreign to her understanding. Each stroke of her pen on a fresh sheet of paper felt like an act of rebellion against the encroaching darkness. She hoped that by documenting her thoughts and emotions regarding the unsettling findings, she could anchor herself amidst the tumult of confusion. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered in the air, a constant reminder that her twin was lurking just beyond the veil of her awareness. Days turned into weeks as Sarah struggled to make sense of her research while grappling with the haunting presence of her twin. The notes in the binder became a source of obsession, each passage unraveling further truths about her fractured identity. But the more she unearthed, the more her reality splintered, leaving her with an insatiable hunger for understanding. With every revelation came a mounting fear: was she the true author of her life, or merely a pawn in a game devised by the consciousness residing within her? The lines between her existence and her twin's blurred, drawing her deeper into a labyrinth where clarity was an illusion. Despite her best efforts to reclaim her sense of self, the notes continued to taunt her with their unsettling clarity. They beckoned her to explore the boundaries of consciousness, to delve into realms she had never considered, pushing her closer to the brink of understanding. But with that understanding came the terrifying realization that she was treading dangerous ground. What if the knowledge she sought was meant to bind her further to the twin? What if her research was not a quest for truth, but a means of capitulation to the very force she wished to escape? With the binder always at her side, Sarah faced each day with a growing sense of urgency. The research notes were not merely a reflection of her academic pursuits, they were a roadmap, leading her deeper into the heart of the darkness she sought to unravel. Every page turned was a step taken into the abyss, a journey she could no longer turn back from. The knowledge contained within those pages could either liberate her or doom her to a fate she feared to contemplate. and as she stared into her reflection, it became clear she had embarked on a path that would determine not just her future, but the very essence of who she was. In the midst of Sarah's chaotic unraveling, the revelation that her career path had been influenced by her twin consciousness weighed heavily on her mind. It was a bitter pill to swallow, the understanding that the choices she believed were entirely her own were, in fact, echoes of a deeper connection. She had dedicated years of her life to neuroscience, driven by a desire to explore the mysteries of consciousness. Yet now that passion felt tainted, manipulated by an unseen force, the very foundation of her identity began to tremble, as if the ground beneath her was shifting and eroding away. Sitting at her desk, Sarah rifled through old journals and notes, seeking some semblance of clarity. She pored over her early reflections, recalling moments of inspiration that had led her to pursue this field. Yet, as she read, she found herself questioning every spark of motivation, every late-night epiphany. Was it her curiosity guiding her, or was it her twin whispering seductive ideas into the recesses of her mind? The thought lingered like a specter, casting a shadow over the accomplishments she had worked so hard to achieve. Her thoughts drifted to her mother's medical records, the remnants of a life she barely understood. The discovery of the twin pregnancy had been a catalyst, revealing the complex threads woven into her very being. The more Sarah pondered, the clearer it became that her choices were not entirely her own. Each decision seemed to echo with the influence of a consciousness that had lain dormant, waiting for the right moment to assert itself. This realization was unsettling, transforming her career into a labyrinth of uncertainty, where the paths taken blurred and twisted in the fog of doubt. As she wandered through her memories, fragments of conversations with colleagues began to surface, moments where they had probed her about her interest in neuroscience. "What drew you to this field?" they would ask, and she would always respond with tales of her childhood fascination, the books she devoured on the subject. But now, as she dissected those narratives, they felt hollow, rehearsed, and scripted. Had her twin orchestrated her responses, manipulating her to present an image that aligned with its own interests? The idea sent shivers coursing through her body, twisting her stomach into knots. She decided to reach out to Dr. Marcus Rivera, her supervisor, hoping he could shed light on her motivations. He had always encouraged her, pushing her to delve deeper into her research. In their meeting, she presented her thoughts, her fears, and the creeping suspicion that her career choices were not purely hers. Marcus listened intently, his brow furrowing as he contemplated her revelations. "You've always been passionate about this field, Sarah," he reassured her, but she sensed a note of hesitation in his voice. It felt as if he were wrestling with an unspoken truth, one that could alter everything she thought she knew about herself. In that moment, Sarah could see the shift in his demeanor, a flicker of concern and perhaps a hint of recognition. "It's not uncommon for individuals in our line of work to feel a strong pull towards certain research topics," he said cautiously. "But if you feel that your interests have been manipulated, that's worth exploring further." His words, while supportive, resonated with an ominous undertone, leaving Sarah feeling adrift in a sea of uncertainty. She left the office with more questions than answers, the gnawing realization that her career was entwined with the very consciousness she sought to understand. Days turned into weeks as Sarah continued her internal struggle, wrestling with the implications of her findings. The more she delved into her research, the more it felt like she was peeling back layers of deception. She began scrutinizing the projects she had chosen, the theories she had developed, seeking evidence of her own agency. Yet with each investigation, she felt the weight of her twin's presence bearing down on her, as if it were pulling strings behind the scenes, orchestrating her life like a master puppeteer. The sensation was suffocating, as if she were standing on the precipice of a dark abyss, and the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. Sarah found herself reflecting on the moments when she had felt an inexplicable connection to her work, the flashes of insight that had come from seemingly nowhere. Were they truly her own, or had they been fed to her by her twin? The boundaries of her identity blurred, leading her to question everything she had ever believed about her passion for neuroscience. It was as though she were trapped in a surreal nightmare, one where her every thought and action was shaped by a force beyond her control. Compelled to seek answers, Sarah spent long hours in the library, poring over case studies and literature on consciousness and identity. She dove into topics surrounding duality, exploring the psychological implications of shared consciousness. As she researched, fragments of her twin's influence continued to rise to the surface, each revelation tightening the grip of anxiety around her heart. The feeling of being an unwitting participant in a life she thought was hers became a harrowing reality, and the realization that her career had been subtly influenced by her twin left her grappling with an identity crisis. In the quiet solitude of the library, surrounded by the scent of aged paper and ink, Sarah felt a mix of fascination and fear. The world of neuroscience was her sanctuary, yet now it felt like a cage, enclosing her within its walls. The studies she had so eagerly pursued became a source of torment, each paper echoing with the laughter of her twin, mocking her quest for independence. Determined to reclaim her narrative, Sarah began to formulate a plan, a way to disentangle herself from the threads that bound her to her twin's influence. As she delved deeper, she discovered references to individuals who had undergone similar experiences of duality, stories that mirrored her own. They spoke of the struggle to assert one's identity amidst the complexities of shared consciousness, of the battle to reclaim autonomy. Sarah clung to these narratives like lifelines, seeking validation in the experiences of others who had fought their way to the surface. It became a mission, a desperate attempt to unearth the truth about herself, her career, and the hidden forces that had shaped her path. But the deeper she ventured into this exploration, the more she felt the pull of her twin consciousness tightening its grip. It was a race against time, a desperate attempt to uncover the truth before she lost herself entirely to the shadows that lurked within. The realization that her entire career had been subtly influenced only fueled her determination to forge her own path, a path that would lead her to confront the entity that had quietly orchestrated her life. The day of her follow-up appointment with Dr. Helen Walsh loomed over Sarah like a storm cloud, heavy with anticipation and dread. She arrived at the Blackwood Institute, the sterile hallways feeling more confining than ever. Each step echoed in the silence, amplifying her anxiety as she recalled the unsettling conversation from weeks prior. The prospect of facing the results of her second set of brain scans sent a shiver down her spine, mingling with the memories of her twin consciousness that had been clawing at the edges of her mind. Once in the examination room, Sarah felt her heart quicken, a restless rhythm that matched the ticking clock on the wall. Dr. Walsh entered with a warm smile, yet it did little to assuage the knot of tension forming in Sarah's stomach. "It's good to see you again," Sarah the neurologist said, her voice soothing but professional. "Let's review your scans and discuss what we found." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard as she braced herself for whatever revelations lay ahead. Dr. Walsh positioned herself at the computer, pulling up the images from the latest MRI. "As you can see here," she began, pointing to the screen, "these images show significant changes compared to your last scan." The brain scans flickered, vivid and detailed, revealing intricate pathways that seemed almost alien to Sarah. As she stared, her mind raced, struggling to comprehend the implications of what she was witnessing. "The neural connections in certain regions have intensified," Dr. Walsh continued, "and there are areas of increased activity that are not typical for someone in your situation." Sarah leaned closer, squinting at the screen, but the complex patterns of light and shadow revealed nothing to her untrained eye. In layman's terms, what does this mean, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Walsh took a moment, her brow furrowing slightly as she considered her response. These changes could indicate a heightened capacity for cognitive function, perhaps even a shift in your brain's processing abilities. It's unusual, but we're still trying to understand the implications fully. A chill crept over Sarah as the weight of the doctor's words sank in. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her experiences, her sudden fluency in Mandarin, the unexplainable bursts of creativity. "So you're saying my brain is changing?" she asked, seeking clarity in the midst of confusion. Dr. Walsh nodded, her expression serious. "It appears that way, but I want to stress that this is still under investigation. We need to monitor these developments closely." The doctor continued, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she pulled up additional data. "We've also noticed something peculiar about your previous scans," she said, her tone shifting. There were subtle signs of unusual neural patterns, almost like two separate systems operating concurrently. This might explain some of your experiences with memory lapses and blackouts. The words hung in the air like an unsolved puzzle, the pieces tantalizingly close yet frustratingly out of reach. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, the reality of her situation washing over her like a cold wave. "Could this be related to my twin?" she ventured, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Walsh regarded her thoughtfully, then nodded slowly. "It's possible. The brain is a complex organ, and shared consciousness can lead to unique neurological manifestations. However, we need more data to draw any definitive conclusions." The uncertainty loomed large, a shadow stretching over Sarah's already fragile psyche. As they delved deeper into the discussion, Sarah's thoughts spiraled in a dizzying array of possibilities. If her brain was indeed being altered by her twin, what did that mean for her sense of self? The idea of two consciousnesses coexisting in one body felt both surreal and terrifying, like living in a waking nightmare. "What can I do to help manage this?" she asked, desperation creeping into her tone. Dr. Walsh offered a reassuring smile, yet Sarah detected an underlying concern in her eyes. "We'll continue monitoring your progress, but I recommend keeping a journal of your experiences. Documenting your thoughts, feelings, and any unusual occurrences can provide valuable insight." Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of resolve and dread. The thought of documenting her descent into this unsettling reality was both daunting and essential. She left the appointment with a new sense of purpose, even as the storm within her mind raged on. The urgency to understand the changes occurring within her brain drove her forward, igniting a fierce determination to uncover the truth behind her fractured identity. As she stepped out of the clinic, the world outside felt strangely muted, the sounds of the bustling city fading into the background. Sarah found herself lost in thought, her mind racing with questions and fears. What if her consciousness was becoming a battleground? What if the more she learned, the more she would lose herself to her twin? The weight of uncertainty settled heavily on her shoulders, a reminder of the fragile balance she was trying to maintain. In the days that followed, the results of the brain scans haunted her. Each time she caught her reflection in the mirror, she felt an unsettling disconnect, as if the person staring back was a mere facade. The shadows of her twin loomed larger, and the question of identity became an echo in her mind. Who was she becoming? With each passing moment, the lines between Sarah and her twin blurred further, leaving her grasping at the fraying edges of her own existence. Determined to take control, Sarah delved into her research with renewed vigor, her mind racing to keep pace with her discoveries. The laboratory became her sanctuary, a place where she could channel her fears into something tangible. She spent hours sifting through studies on neuroplasticity, consciousness, and identity, desperately seeking answers. The more she learned, the more the pieces of her fractured identity began to fall into place. Yet with each revelation, the uncertainty loomed larger, whispering that the battle for her consciousness had only just begun. Days turned into weeks, and as Sarah immersed herself deeper into her research, the reality of her situation began to crystallize in her mind. The unsettling notion that her twin consciousness was not just a passive entity, but an active force guiding her life became an inescapable truth. Each time she sat in her cluttered apartment, surrounded by books and notes, she felt a profound weight pressing down on her chest, a pressure that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the darker corners of her psyche. One evening, as twilight deepened and shadows crept across her walls, Sarah sat cross-legged on her living room floor. A sea of paper sprawled out before her. Among them lay her journal, filled with fragments of her thoughts and the gradual unraveling of her identity. Flipping through the pages, she paused at a specific entry that had sent chills down her spine upon writing it. It outlined her uncanny ability to recall details about her life that she had never lived, as if memories were being carefully crafted and inserted into her mind. The realization that someone or something was orchestrating her thoughts sent a shiver through her. Fueled by a sense of urgency, Sarah began to connect the dots between her recent discoveries and the evolving nature of her consciousness. She scoured her research materials, seeking patterns that might reveal her twin's intentions. With each passing day, it became clear that her twin had been influencing her choices long before she ever became aware of its presence. Every meticulous decision regarding her career path in neuroscience now felt tainted, manipulated by an unseen hand that had shaped her aspirations and desires from the very beginning. The twins' influence manifested in subtle ways that now appeared glaringly obvious in retrospect. Sarah recalled her fascination with consciousness studies, an interest that seemed to burgeon overnight, propelled by an instinctual drive to explore the very fabric of human identity. It was as if her twin had been feeding her these thoughts, planting seeds of curiosity that flourished into an all-consuming obsession with understanding consciousness. The deeper she dug, the more unnerving it became. What if her entire career was a carefully orchestrated ruse? Late at night, when the world outside her window faded into silence, Sarah would find herself wandering the dimly lit halls of the Blackwood Institute, retracing the steps of her research. The soft glow of her desk lamp illuminated the chaos of her notes, which seemed to pulsate with a life of their own. With every note she penned, she felt a growing disquiet, as if her hand moved with a purpose beyond her conscious control. Were these ideas her own, or had they been commandeered by her twin's hidden agenda? The distinction blurred, leaving her with an unsettling sense of being a mere puppet in a game she didn't fully understand. One particular night, exhaustion tugging at her eyelids, Sarah stumbled across a series of articles on neural synchronization and shared consciousness. The content resonated with her in a way that felt almost visceral, igniting a sense of recognition. As she read through the scientific jargon, it struck her twin wasn't just influencing her, it was likely orchestrating the entire framework of her research. The implications were staggering, as the notion of shared consciousness suggested that her twin had been preparing for a convergence that would irrevocably alter their lives. Trembling, Sarah started to hypothesize how this merging might unfold. Could it be that her twin had spent years crafting a plan to reclaim its identity through her? The more she pondered, the clearer it became that her research could be a means to an end, a bridge between their two consciousnesses. Yet an unsettling question lingered: what would happen if the twin succeeded? Would she remain intact, or would she be subsumed entirely, losing herself in the process? As she contemplated the intricacies of their shared existence, an idea began to form, a desperate hope that perhaps the research could offer her a way to gain control over this burgeoning duality. If she could manipulate the findings to her advantage, Could she potentially strengthen her own consciousness and prevent the twin from overtaking her? With renewed determination, Sarah set out to explore every avenue, poring over studies and theories that hinted at the possibility of merging without losing individuality. In her quest for answers, Sarah found herself immersed in the theories of consciousness unification, a burgeoning field that danced on the precipice of ethical quandaries and scientific exploration. The more she delved into the literature, the more she recognized parallels between the research and her own lived experience. Each study seemed to speak to her directly, revealing a path forward that could allow her to harness the power of her dual existence, rather than succumb to it. Yet, doubt gnawed at her. Was she truly in control, or was she still dancing to the twins' silent tune? The line between self-preservation and surrender blurred, creating a tension that crackled in the air. Every time she looked in the mirror, she felt the weight of her duality reflected back at her, a haunting reminder of the battle waging within. But even amidst the turmoil, a flicker of defiance ignited in her heart. If her twin thought it could orchestrate her life, it had another thing coming. She was ready to reclaim her narrative. With each revelation, Sarah began to plot a course for her research, a plan not just to explore consciousness, but to confront the entity that sought to overshadow her. The very act of studying the mechanisms of shared consciousness became a rebellion against the manipulation she had endured. Armed with knowledge, she would not only navigate the treacherous waters of her existence, but would also strive to emerge as the rightful architect of her own destiny. In the depths of her research, a harrowing realization began to unfurl, wrapping around Sarah's mind like a vise. The very project she had dedicated herself to, an exploration of consciousness, its mechanisms, and the potential for unification, was not just an academic pursuit, it was a battleground for her very identity. As she pored over her findings, the implications twisted in her mind, revealing a stark and unsettling truth. Her twin consciousness was positioning itself to take control, leveraging her research as a means to usurp her existence. The more she studied, the more she grasped the delicate interplay between their shared consciousness. The scientific literature described scenarios where separate consciousnesses could interact, potentially merging into a singular entity. In her case, it was as if her twin had been preparing for this moment all along, using her passion for neuroscience as a cloak for its ulterior motives. Each page she turned echoed with the ominous undertones of a sinister plan, an orchestration designed to culminate in her subjugation. One evening, deep into her research, Sarah stumbled across a groundbreaking paper discussing the mechanics of consciousness merging. The authors detailed experiments where individuals with split consciousness could theoretically unite their minds, creating a more powerful singular identity. As she read, a chill crept down her spine. This was precisely what her twin desired. The twin was not merely seeking coexistence, it aimed to absorb her, to assimilate Sarah into a stronger entity that would erase her autonomy. The implications of this realization struck her like a thunderclap. This was not a partnership, it was a takeover. Confronted with this unsettling truth, Sarah's mind raced. How long had her twin been plotting this? Was every choice she made, every decision she thought was hers, simply a step toward this inevitable merging? The thought made her skin crawl. The creeping dread that her twin was not just an intruder in her mind, but a shadow lurking behind every moment of her life, waiting for the opportune time to seize control. The very essence of her research, once a source of inspiration, transformed into a weapon forged against her. Determined to reclaim her narrative, Sarah began to reframe her approach to the research. Instead of merely exploring the possibilities of consciousness merging, she shifted her focus to uncovering methods of defense, ways to fortify her identity against the encroaching presence of her twin. She pored over studies that examined the boundaries of consciousness, searching for any indication that could help her assert her autonomy. Each article became a lifeline, a potential key to thwarting the insidious plans of her counterpart. Yet, with every new discovery, the weight of her predicament pressed heavily upon her. The more she learned, the clearer it became that her twin was already entwined within the fibers of her consciousness, intricately woven into her thoughts and desires. It was a puppet master pulling strings, an echo of her own voice whispering ideas and aspirations that felt all too familiar yet disturbingly foreign. In her darkest moments, she feared that she might not be strong enough to resist the inevitable pull of the twins' influence. As Sarah delved deeper, her dreams became a chaotic mix of memories and sensations, blurring the lines between her reality and the experiences her twin might have lived. Fragmented images of places she had never been flooded her mind, each one taunting her with its vividness. Was this her life? Or was she merely a spectator in a grand performance directed by her twin? The anxiety gnawed at her, feeding a growing sense of paranoia that her mind was no longer her own. Determined not to succumb, Sarah began documenting every moment of clarity she experienced, hoping to differentiate her own thoughts from those of her twin. The journal became her sanctuary, a place to assert her identity amidst the chaos. She chronicled her fears, her victories, and her struggles against the encroaching tide, a testament to her will to remain herself. It was a silent rebellion, an act of defiance against the shadow that loomed over her. The more she wrote, the more she uncovered patterns in her behavior that had been masked by the twins' influence. Certain decisions felt eerily calculated, as if they were made with an agenda rather than genuine intent. The realization that her twin was not just a separate entity but a manipulative force within her own psyche sent shivers down her spine. It was not simply a matter of coexistence, it was a battle for dominance, and she was acutely aware of the stakes. As she continued her work, the tension within her mounted. The research she had initially viewed as a potential lifeline now felt like a ticking clock, a countdown to a confrontation she both anticipated and dreaded. Her twin was out there, lurking in the shadows of her mind, biding its time, waiting for the precise moment to claim victory. With every passing day, Sarah felt the urgency intensifying, compelling her to delve deeper into her studies and fight back against the force threatening to overwhelm her. Yet the question lingered like a specter: could she truly fight this battle alone? The lines between their consciousnesses were becoming increasingly blurred, and as much as she yearned to reclaim her autonomy, she could not shake the fear that she was merely a pawn in a game that had been set in motion long before she became aware of its existence. The time for reckoning was approaching, and Sarah steeled herself for the confrontation that loomed just beyond the horizon. As the days melded into an indistinct blur, Sarah felt the tightening grip of her twin consciousness suffocating her sense of self. It began with subtle shifts, minor lapses in her memory that felt like moments of disorientation, but soon escalated into outright episodes where she would find herself in unfamiliar settings, unable to recall how she had arrived there. The unsettling realization dawned on her that her twin was not just lurking in the shadows, it was actively seizing control of her life, steering her into dark corners she had never intended to explore. In one particularly jarring instance, Sarah awakened to find herself standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection staring back was not entirely hers. It wore a smile she did not recognize, an expression tinged with a sinister glee that sent chills racing down her spine. The eyes that reflected back at her seemed to shimmer with a malicious intent, almost as if the twin was delighting in her growing fear. The longer she stood there, transfixed by the unholy apparition, the more she felt her own will begin to slip away, eroded by the encroaching force of her other self. Desperation clawed at her as she raced to reclaim her mind. The thought of being lost to this insidious takeover fueled her determination, pushing her to explore every possible avenue for understanding how to halt the merger. Night after night, she delved into her research, sifting through the studies and articles that now felt like a lifeline. But the deeper she probed, the more she unearthed evidence that suggested her twin's influence was not a mere byproduct of her chimerism. It was a calculated effort to dominate her entire existence. Every breakthrough felt like a double-edged sword. While each piece of information brought her closer to understanding the phenomenon, it also highlighted the power her twin held. She began to notice patterns in her life choices made that seemed orchestrated rather than spontaneous. An unsettling chill danced along her skin as she realized how easily her twin manipulated her actions, crafting a facade that allowed it to masquerade as her, while quietly dismantling her sense of autonomy. Sarah's nights became haunted by vivid dreams, nightmarish scenarios where her twin embodied a grotesque version of herself, laughing and taunting as it led her through twisted labyrinths of her own making. In these dreams, Sarah felt the edges of her identity blur, a haunting cacophony of voices whispering in her ear, drowning her in a sea of confusion and despair. The dreams, once just fragments of anxiety, morphed into elaborate displays of her twin's growing strength, a disorienting reminder of the danger lurking just beneath her conscious awareness. During one particularly harrowing episode, Sarah found herself in the sterile embrace of her laboratory, surrounded by the familiar hum of machinery. But the moment she reached for a vial of sample fluid, her body hesitated. The hand that once moved with purpose now felt alien, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. She watched, horrified, as her body continued the motion without her consent, pouring the liquid into a beaker, conducting experiments that had never been part of her plans. The twin was taking the reins, and she was powerless to stop it. In a frantic attempt to wrest back control, Sarah sought out Dr. Helen, desperate for answers and guidance. The weight of her revelation settled heavily in her chest as she detailed the episodes to her neurologist, a sense of urgency propelling her words. Dr. Helen listened intently, her brow furrowing with concern as Sarah shared her fears of losing herself entirely to the twin. The doctor, sensing the gravity of the situation, ordered another round of tests, her expression betraying the unease that lingered in the air. While waiting for results, Sarah's mind raced with the implications of what her twin was attempting. The idea that she could potentially merge with this darker aspect of herself sent tremors through her very core. The thought of becoming a vessel for an entity that had bided its time in the shadows was unbearable. As she sat in the waiting room, the sterile environment felt suffocating, each tick of the clock amplifying her anxiety, reminding her that time was slipping through her fingers. Her instincts screamed that the twin was not just an alter ego, it was a parasite, feeding off her essence, waiting for the opportune moment to emerge fully. With every passing day, the sense of urgency escalated. She felt trapped in a race against an unseen adversary, struggling to keep her head above water as the tide of her twin's influence surged. As the walls began to close in, the reality that she might have to confront her twin head-on loomed ominously, a dark specter of inevitability casting its shadow over her every thought. Back in her apartment, Sarah established a new routine, a desperate attempt to ground herself in the reality she still clung to. Journals filled with frantic notes cluttered her desk, each entry a testament to her resolve not to be outmaneuvered. She began to create a structure around her life, mapping out the details of her days, hoping that by maintaining control over her schedule, she could stave off the creeping uncertainty. Yet, the harder she fought, the more elusive her grasp on reality became. Every evening, as she prepared for bed, she would catch glimpses of her twin in the mirror, watching her with an insidious grin that sent her heart racing. Each night, Sarah fortified her mind, repeating affirmations like a mantra, refusing to yield to the encroaching darkness. But as she lay in bed, sleep evading her, she could feel the presence creeping closer, the constant reminder that her twin was growing stronger, waiting for its moment to strike. In a desperate bid for clarity, Sarah threw herself into the research surrounding the nature of consciousness. She scoured for insights that could aid her in the fight, seeking to understand the mechanisms that govern the merging of identities. With each page turned, she felt the grip of her twin tighten, as if her twin were savoring the challenge, relishing her struggle against the inevitable. This was not merely an academic pursuit, it was an urgent plea for survival, a fight against the tide threatening to pull her under. With the shadows of uncertainty closing in, Sarah braced herself for what lay ahead. The confrontation was coming, and as she prepared for battle, she steeled her resolve against the chilling certainty that her twin was not just an echo of her past, but a formidable force bent on seizing her life. The stakes were higher than ever, and she had to be ready for the dark reality that awaited her, a face-off with the entity that had been lurking within her for far too long. The air in Sarah's apartment thickened with dread as she began to unravel the truth behind her twin's existence. What she once thought was a series of oddities and strange coincidences coalesced into a chilling narrative of calculated manipulation. It was no longer just about her fractured identity, it was a revelation that struck at the very core of her being. Her twin had been lying in wait, a predator slowly closing in on its prey. The weight of this knowledge bore down on her like a suffocating fog, making it hard to breathe, hard to think clearly. In her darkest moments, Sarah replayed the timeline of her life, tracing back the moments that now felt orchestrated. It was as if the twin had woven a web of control around her from the very beginning. She recalled her childhood, the moments when she felt a vague sense of being, different feelings of déjà vu and memories that seemed just out of reach. The childhood whispers that had plagued her were suddenly clearer. They were not merely figments of her imagination, but echoes of her twin's influence that had been quietly guiding her actions all along. As she examined her past, the truth morphed into a grotesque tapestry of stolen experiences. Every choice she made, every direction her life took, seemed intertwined with her twin's hidden agenda. She recalled her journey into neuroscience, the passion that had drawn her in like a moth to flame. But now, that passion felt tainted. Was it truly hers, or had it been an echo of her twin's desire to dominate her life? The lines between her identity and the twin's were blurring, and she grappled with the nauseating realization that her dreams of success had been merely a pathway for the twin's ambition to flourish. Sarah's research notes began to read like a sinister diary of her twin's long-term plan for dominance. The meticulous records chronicled ideas and theories that felt foreign to her, ideas that danced just outside her comprehension. Pages filled with insights into neuroscience revealed an unnerving understanding of consciousness, as if her twin had methodically pieced together a framework for the merger. The chilling implication was undeniable. This knowledge was a weapon, and she was the unwitting pawn in a grander scheme orchestrated by her twin. The more Sarah delved into her notes, the more she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Each line she read was laced with the chilling certainty that the twin was not just a fragment of her past, but a potent force of cunning and intelligence. The idea that her twin had been pulling strings behind the scenes for decades sent shivers coursing through her veins. It was a horrifying realization that her life had been a carefully curated illusion, and she was merely a vessel for her twin's desires and ambitions. As the days crept by, paranoia settled in like an unwelcome guest. Sarah started questioning her own memories, replaying interactions with friends and colleagues. Had she truly made those decisions? Did she really laugh at that joke or offer that opinion? The incessant questioning gnawed at her, leaving her feeling fractured and unmoored. It was as though she was watching a puppet show from behind the curtain, her strings pulled by a puppeteer she could neither see nor comprehend. One evening, in a moment of desperation, Sarah turned to the only ally she had left her: research. She opened her laptop, scanning through her saved articles and notes, hoping to find answers. As she read, the dark truths began to surface, revealing a shocking perspective on consciousness, identity, and the very nature of self. The chilling studies on dual consciousness were like a mirror reflecting her own reality. The words were no longer just academic, they felt like a warning, a dire premonition of what was to come if she didn't act quickly. The clock ticked ominously in the background, a constant reminder that time was not on her side. Every moment spent in fear was a moment the twin could use to cement its control over her. She felt the walls of her existence closing in, the air thick with the weight of impending doom. The urgency to confront her twin's growing strength became paramount. She could not remain a passive observer in this horrifying saga. The twins' long game had finally reached a critical point, and she knew that any further delays could lead to an irreversible merger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her room, Sarah's resolve solidified. The twin had waited patiently, biding its time, but she would no longer be a passive participant in her own life. The dread of the inevitable confrontation loomed large in her mind, but the flicker of determination ignited within her. This was a battle for her very identity, a struggle for survival against the insidious force that sought to consume her whole. In a moment of clarity, Sarah understood that knowledge would be her greatest weapon. She immersed herself in every bit of research she could find, scouring journals and articles that explored the depths of consciousness. The more she read, the more she became acutely aware of the potential consequences of their merger. It wasn't just about losing herself, it was about the erasure of everything she had ever known, a complete annihilation of her identity as the twin took the helm of their shared existence. As the nights dragged on, the creeping sense of urgency transformed into a fierce determination to reclaim her life. Sarah refused to let her twin dictate the narrative any longer. It was time to seize control and confront the dark specter that had haunted her for far too long. The stakes were higher than ever, and with the chilling knowledge of her twin's waiting game, she prepared herself for the battle ahead. The horror of her situation would not define her, she would stand against it, drawing strength from the resolve that coursed through her veins. With her heart pounding in her chest, she began to formulate a plan. Sarah knew that the confrontation would not be easy. The twin was cunning, and it had spent years understanding her vulnerabilities. But the thought of losing herself completely ignited a fire within her, a fierce desire to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The showdown would come, and when it did, she would be ready. The time for hiding was over now. Was the moment for action, for standing against the darkness that sought to engulf her. The night seemed to stretch on indefinitely as Sarah sank deeper into the abyss of her revelations. With every passing moment, the shadows in her apartment felt more oppressive, closing in as if they had eyes, watching her every move. She could almost hear her twins whisper in the silence, a sinister echo resonating in her mind, urging her to succumb to the darkness. It was an unsettling sensation, as though her very thoughts were no longer hers alone, but part of a larger, more malevolent design. The twin had not just been waiting, it had been preparing, honing its influence over her as if they were playing an intricate game of cat and mouse, with the stakes growing ever higher. As she replayed the fragmented memories of her life, the horrific realization settled in her bones: she might not be the original Sarah. The possibility that her twin was the stronger consciousness began to haunt her like a persistent specter. Every moment spent in reflection revealed an unsettling truth: her identity, her very essence, was now in question. In the quiet moments, she felt the twin's presence lurking beneath her skin, an unsettling awareness that it was biding its time, ready to pounce when she least expected it. Each flicker of doubt only fueled her anxiety, wrapping around her heart like a constricting vine, tightening with every thought. Sarah's mind spiraled into a vortex of uncertainty as she remembered the signs, the blackouts, the strange memories, the unrecognizable photos. Each piece of evidence served as a reminder that her life had been meticulously curated by someone else, perhaps her twin, waiting for the moment to emerge. The very foundation of her existence felt like quicksand, shifting beneath her as she struggled to find solid ground. The whispers of her past became more pronounced, each taunting her with half-formed recollections of experiences that had never belonged to her. The more she explored, the more the terror sank its claws into her psyche. The truth began to crystallize into a horrifying clarity the twin had been patiently planning, strategizing its ascent to power while she remained blissfully unaware. It was chilling to think of all those years spent in ignorance, every decision and action meticulously crafted by her twin's hidden hand. A sense of betrayal coursed through her veins. Her life had been a lie, a facade maintained by a consciousness that sought nothing but dominance. The anger at her twin's manipulation surged through her like a tidal wave, crashing against the shore of her sanity. How could she have been so blind? As she rummaged through her old journals and notes, Sarah felt a growing dread. The meticulously recorded thoughts that once felt familiar now echoed with a sense of foreboding, as if the twin had left behind a trail of breadcrumbs leading her to this very moment. Every scribbled note, every idea jotted down in the heat of inspiration now felt like an ominous signpost pointing toward her impending doom. It was as if her twin was laughing at her from the shadows, reveling in the chaos it had wrought, feeding off her fear and confusion. Each new discovery was a reminder that she was not alone in her head. There was a darker presence lurking just beneath the surface. The weight of the revelation crashed down upon her like a wave, leaving her gasping for breath. The idea that her twin had orchestrated this existence was both fascinating and horrifying, a stark reminder of the thin line between life and the macabre. She imagined her twin lurking in the recesses of her mind, a serpent coiling tighter with each passing second. It was no longer just a battle for her identity, it was a race against time to reclaim her own life before it slipped entirely out of her grasp. The thought of her twin taking control, her voice drowning out her own, sent icy tendrils of fear crawling up her spine. As she sat alone in the dim light of her living room, Sarah felt the very walls of her apartment pulse with a malevolent energy. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, taunting her with their elusive forms. Each flicker of light brought with it a sense of foreboding, as if they were playing tricks on her, revealing glimpses of her twin lurking just out of sight. She felt her sanity unraveling, threads of reality slipping through her fingers as her twin's presence grew stronger, more assertive. The closer she got to the truth, the more she sensed the twin's frustration boiling beneath the surface, eager to break free from its confinement. In her darkest moments, she could almost hear the whispers of her twin, promising her power, knowledge, and an escape from her mundane existence. It was a seductive offer, one that threatened to pull her into the depths of darkness, but she resisted with all her might. The fear of becoming a mere shadow of herself, a puppet dancing on strings controlled by her twin, drove her to stand firm. She refused to give in to the sweet seduction of surrender. No matter how enticing the promise of unity felt, it came at the cost of her very identity, and that was a price she was unwilling to pay. Yet, despite her defiance, the creeping sensation of inevitability loomed large, casting a long shadow over her resolve. The more she fought, the more she could feel the twin's influence seep into her thoughts, eroding her sense of self. She understood that time was running out. Every moment spent battling her own mind drew her closer to the brink of losing herself completely. A chilling question echoed in her mind: would she emerge victorious, or would her twin finally take control, erasing the last remnants of who she was? The final realization hit her with the force of a freight train. If her twin was indeed the original consciousness, then what did that make her? Was she the imposter in her own life, a mere echo of a girl who had once existed before being overshadowed? The thought was maddening, a spiraling descent into an abyss of despair and confusion. The truth felt like a noose tightening around her neck, leaving her gasping for clarity as she stood on the precipice of a revelation that could shatter her world entirely. In that moment, she felt the twin's presence surge within her, a wave of dark energy that threatened to engulf her whole. It was a chilling reminder that the battle was far from over, it was just beginning. As her mind raced with the implications of her discoveries, she steeled herself for the confrontation that awaited her. She would no longer be a passive participant in this horror story. She was ready to confront the darkness that had claimed so much of her life. With renewed determination, she prepared herself for the ultimate test of her will, ready to reclaim her identity from the clutches of the very being that sought to obliterate it. Here's the revised version of the confrontation, with a focus on one or two scenes with different men, elaborating more on each interaction to enhance the creepiness and psychological tension. Sarah stood before the bathroom mirror, her reflection staring back with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The glow of the overhead light cast stark shadows on her face, highlighting the tension etched into her features. It felt as if the mirror was a portal, a boundary between her consciousness and the other, a dark, insistent presence that lurked just beneath the surface. She took a deep breath, fighting against the wave of unease that washed over her. "I know you're there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can feel you trying to take over." The reflection seemed to shift, a subtle yet unsettling change that made her heart race. The eyes looking back at her darkened slightly, a flicker of something otherworldly shimmering within them. "You can't escape me," Sarah, a voice echoed in her mind, its tone chillingly familiar yet foreign. It was her own voice, yet tinged with an underlying malice that made her stomach twist. "You've always known I was here, waiting. It's time for us to become one." Panic surged through her as she fought to maintain control. "You're not me," she retorted, her voice rising in defiance. "I won't let you take my life." But as she spoke, she could feel the creeping tendrils of the twins' influence slithering through her thoughts, blurring the lines between them. It was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, urging her to surrender to the darkness. Sarah clenched her fists, grounding herself in the reality of her own identity, but doubt seeped in, whispering insidious questions. "Why fight it?" the twin urged, a seductive melody lacing its words. "Don't you see how much stronger we could be together? All those years of hiding, of feeling incomplete, it's all because I've been trapped inside you." Sarah's reflection seemed to smile, but the expression didn't match the horror brewing within her. "You're nothing without me. I'm the original. I'm the one who deserves to live." "Stop lying," Sarah shouted, frustration bubbling over. The tiles beneath her felt cold and unyielding as she steadied herself, staring deep into the eyes of her reflection. "I won't let you erase my memories, my experiences." The twins' laughter reverberated in her mind, a sound both haunting and mocking. "Memories? Your memories are a mere facade, a fragile illusion. I am what you were meant to be. Embrace me, and we can unlock our true potential." As the twins' voice echoed in her thoughts, images flashed before Sarah's eyes, vivid, unsettling memories of moments she could not recall. "Those moments were mine," Sarah gasped, feeling the weight of betrayal heavy in her chest. "I would never hurt anyone like that," but the reflection merely laughed, a cruel sound that echoed ominously within her. "You're starting to understand, aren't you? You think you have control, but I am the one who shapes reality. You have no idea how many lives I've altered, how many secrets I've kept." "Get out of my head," Sarah screamed, her voice reverberating in the small bathroom. I am stronger than you think, but as she said it, doubt crept back in, gnawing at her resolve. The twins' influence seeped deeper, wrapping around her consciousness like a shroud. You don't know who you are. Your entire existence has been a series of careful deceptions. I'm the one who deserves to emerge, it hissed, the voice growing darker, more sinister. For a moment, silence fell heavy in the air. Sarah's heart raced as she stared into her reflection, grappling with the unsettling reality that the twins' presence was growing stronger, more confident. You think you can resist me forever, the twin taunted, its voice like ice. Sooner or later you'll understand that it is futile. I will take what is rightfully mine. In that moment of despair, a flicker of determination ignited within Sarah. I will fight you with everything I have, she declared, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I won't let you win, the reflection smirked, an unsettling glint in its eye that sent shivers down her spine. We'll see about that, it purred, the echo of its laughter resonating in the depths of her mind, a chilling reminder that the battle had only just begun. The bathroom was shrouded in an unsettling silence as Sarah stood transfixed before the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. The reflection that stared back at her was unsettling. Her eyes flickered with an intensity that felt alien, as if another presence lurked just beneath the surface. The twins' voice, smooth and enticing, coiled around her mind like smoke, whispering promises of liberation and power that threatened to drown out her will. Let me in, Sarah, the twins' voice echoed, both sweet and sinister. You felt my influence, my gifts. Together, we can be unstoppable. Stop resisting and embrace who you really are. As the words wrapped around her consciousness, Sarah felt her resolve begin to crack. Memories of intimacy with strangers surged forward, seductive and disorienting, as her heart raced with both fear and an unexpected thrill. No, she choked out, forcing her hands to steady themselves against the cool surface of the sink. You're not me. I won't let you take over. The twin chuckled softly, the sound chilling in the silence of the room. But you're already mine. Every blacked out moment is proof of my power. You think you can fight me? I am the strength you've longed for, the one who has waited patiently in the shadows while you lived your mundane life. No, Sarah shouted, her voice echoing through the small space, trembling with defiance. But even as she spoke, she felt her own thoughts slipping away, the twins' presence tightening its grip around her mind like a vise. I won't give in. I will fight you. Fight? Oh, my sweet Sarah, the twin purred, the reflection in the mirror twisting and warping, revealing a monstrous visage that blended their features into one grotesque creation. You cannot fight what is already part of you. I am the darkness that shadows your every step, the passion you've suppressed. Let me show you the freedom you crave. Suddenly, the memories flooded in like a torrent, each one more vivid than the last. Sarah found herself reliving moments that felt both familiar and foreign, dark alleys filled with whispers and laughter, the flickering light of street lamps casting shadows on fleeting figures. Each memory was tinged with an undercurrent of danger and excitement as the twin began to take control, guiding Sarah through the recollections of stolen kisses and whispered secrets with strangers, moments of intimacy that blurred the lines of ownership and desire. Stop it, Sarah cried out, desperation flooding her voice as she wrestled against the encroaching tide of memories. This isn't me, but with each pulse of the twins' influence, her protests drew weaker, her identity fracturing under the weight of shared experiences that were not hers. With a final surge, Sarah pressed her hands against the mirror, her reflection warping and rippling as the twin pushed forward, eager to seize control. You're losing, Sarah. You've always been weak. Let me take the reins, the twin urged, her voice seductive and strong. Embrace me, and you'll be so much more than you ever dreamed." As Sarah fought against the encroaching darkness, she felt a flicker of hope diminish, swallowed by the overwhelming realization that her efforts were futile. The twin was too strong, her influence too deeply embedded. "I won't," she gasped. But even as the words left her lips, she felt the warmth of surrender creeping in. With one final, desperate attempt to hold on, Sarah met her twin's gaze in the mirror. "I won't be forgotten," she whispered, but the resolve in her voice faltered, weakened by the twin's unwavering conviction. In an instant, the twin surged forth, a tidal wave of darkness crashing over Sarah's consciousness. She felt herself fade, her identity dissolving into the shadows as the twin took control, her laughter echoing in the corners of Sarah's mind. "Welcome home," the twin purred, her voice now laced with triumphant malice. The mirror reflected a singular figure, their features eerily familiar yet unsettlingly different. Sarah was gone, replaced by the twin, who smiled back with an unsettling sense of victory. "Now, let the world see who we truly are," she said, a new wickedness sparking in her eyes as she stepped away from the mirror, leaving Sarah's memories in essence behind, forever lost in the dark depths of another's ambition. As we reach the end of tonight's stories on Hauntales, it's time to let your mind drift away. Listen to the sound of the rain gently falling in the background. Let each drop calm your thoughts and ease you into a peaceful sleep. There's nothing to fear now, just the soothing rhythm of the rain. Focus on your breathing, let your body relax, and allow yourself to drift deeper into rest. Sleep peacefully, and we'll meet again tomorrow night for another story. Good night.